Hello, well today I'm going to be making a knife sheath, and it's a great project actually. If you want to try a bit of leather work, have a go at doing something, make a sheath for a knife, something like this, a fairly standard bushcraft knife. And what I'll be covering will actually be all the principles that could apply to any sort of knife pretty well that you might have to make a sheath. I'm going to keep it fairly straightforward. So going to be covering things like selecting the leather, cutting out a paper pattern, some wet moulding to make it shape the knife nicely, stitching up, dyeing, etc, etc. So all the steps you need to make a nice knife sheath yourself. So let's get going. Well, it's best to start off making a paper pattern because it means you get a nice snug fit when you actually put your knife in the sheath. The risk if you don't have a pattern to start with is you waste leather, you end up with something where the knife rattles around, or worse still, you can't get it in the sheath. So there are different approaches you can do for paper pattern making. One approach, which I'm not going to do today, is you sketch out a pattern. So here's a pattern I've typically sketched out. And the idea with this sort of approach is you put your knife on the sheet of paper and then you draw all around using best estimation. Generally I find it's fairly accurate, but it is a bit hit and miss, so it's not one I recommend if you're having a go for the first time. So the safer approach is you take some paper like this, you pop your knife in it and you fold it over. So let me fold it over like that. Now that's the blunt edge of the knife, just so you know. So I'm playing a little bit safe here. And then you crease it to get the outline of the knife. Once you've creased it a bit, you can start to draw around the paper. So at the moment I'm just creasing it. I'll put it on my workbench in a minute and start drawing around. That gives you a nice impression so you know how thick the handle of the knife is in terms of leather requirement. It's very difficult to estimate that otherwise. Going to be sewing a welt on this knife. I'll explain in a minute what a welt is, but basically it's an additional layer of leather to stop the blade of the knife cutting your stitching. But we'll come to that in a minute. So let's get it on the bench and I'll show you how I mark it out. So just doing a quick test fit of the paper sheath, and that seems fine. So obviously it's quite generous around here at the moment, but that will get trimmed off. So, and this is the bit I'm going to be folding over for the belt. So what it means is you can sew this flap there and you've got like a belt mounting. As I say, all of that will get trimmed. So what I'm going to do next is actually mould the leather to the shape of the knife. So I'm going to do a bit of wet moulding, and for that I need to soak the leather. Well, as luck would have it, I've got a fairly nice, almost perfect offcut of leather here, so I'm just going to quickly cut round. Now the leather I'm using, it's probably a tad thicker than I would choose. This is like 3mm, very roughly, something like an 8-ounce leather. For knife sheaths, something like 2.5mm is probably pretty good actually, all in all. But I think this will do. I'm just using a rotary knife to cut it. Let's do some of the cuts. One could use a clicker knife or whatever other knife you enjoy using. I quite like these rotary knives. I feel they're a bit safer than a lot of knives. The other one that's very good for doing some fine detail cuts, getting around tight corners, is this clicker knife. All of this at the moment, it's fairly crude, but as I say, it's going to end up being trimmed. I'm just going to wrap the knife up in a bit of cling film, basically to stop the water damaging it. So this is because I'm going to be putting it into wet leather. Hopefully be enough. Try and press it in a bit. There we are. It's one cling film knife. I'm then got a nice jug of fairly warm water here. I've got my leather. I'm going to soak it in. This will make the leather nice and sort of supple so that I can mould it around the knife. So I'm sort of what they're calling wet forming. If you get veg tan leather and you soak it into water, it makes it quite so pliable, and it's quite good if you want to make things like pouches and stuff like that. So you can see the air escaping at quite a rapid rate. Okay, it's had a few minutes and you can see it's gone dark all over. And then start shaping the leather around it and just sort of manipulate it with my fingers. Just making sure I've got enough margin, which I have, for my seams. So the leather will have a certain amount of like give on it, and I'm just going to carry on trying to sort of squish it into place. Now, as I say, I'm using like a 3mm, 3.5mm thick leather here, which I think is ideally a bit thicker. 2.5mm would be better, but it will make a nice robust knife sheath, so it doesn't matter too much. I can peg it, and I'm using little sort of sewing pegs, but I've put a bit of leather over there so as not to mark the surface too much. I mean, in reality it will pick up some marking, but just want to try and avoid it picking up too much. So I'll whiz these along and just peg it all around. So there you are. I'll let that dry now, and then it'll be ready for the next step. Well, the knife's actually taken the cling film off. It's quite a tight fit, which is what I was hoping for. And one might be a bit alarmed, so what's happened is the leather has shrunk. But actually, by the time you've put the welt in here, it will obviously open it out a little bit. So it's just as well it has shrunk actually. But I'm going to take the pegs off and hope it hasn't marked everything too much. No, it's not too bad. The idea of the little leather patches is to stop the pegs really marking the surface. I mean, they will mark it a bit. That seems all right. And you can see it's quite solid. So it's held the shape, and that's really the main purpose behind the wet moulding. What I'm going to do next, I'm going to just trim this up a bit so that I get the sort of belt loop side a bit smaller, a bit more in sort of keeping, and I'm going to also trim down here a bit and make a welt. Now, the idea of the welt, I'm going to be stitching this seam here, and if I didn't have a welt, as you put the knife into the sheath, it would just cut through the stitching because there'd be nothing to protect it. And the idea of the welt is it stops basically the knife being able to cut the stitches. You'll see what I mean when I actually come to do it, but it puts in a protective barrier of leather basically to stop that happening. So I've just placed the knife on top of the sheath, and what I'm very broadly doing is giving a good centimetre of clearance for the stitching, etc. I can trim it back more later if I need to, but I just want to. So I'm going to trim off where I've got this marked line. If I hold the knife there, you can probably start to get a bit of an idea of the sort of margin I'm leaving. It's about 1 centimetre roughly. So I will now cut this off. What I've now got is a greatly slimmed down knife sheath, and so the knife goes in like that. I'll be interested, I think it's taking okay, to see how the die takes on the inner leather surface. It's been semi-treated. It's nice if you can get it untreated actually, but it does look like it's going to take. So I'm just giving these edges a bit of a smooth while the die's there, because that will actually help press the fibres down a bit. And I'm using a wooden slicker, giving the edges a little round over using a little edge beveling tool. Give this front edge a little bit of curving off. Oops. There we are. And ditto on the inside so you don't get this sort of edge turning up like that. A bit more dye on that. Again, I'll just rub it over. To cut my welts, I'm just taking the knife itself, and I'm going to effectively draw around the blade with this scratch awl, and that would just tell me the sort of line to take up to it. And then if I can find my clicker knife, I'll cut that out. So what I then have is basically a strip of leather which will get sewn in, so when the knife blade comes down it doesn't hit the stitches, it just hits this bit of leather. I'm just roughing up the welt a little bit just so the glue sticks. So this leather, it's got a very slight light coating on one side. So I'm just doing a final trial fit of my welt. So here's the welt. It will go between the two layers of stitching here, and I've just got it placed in what I think is the right position against the blade of the knife. So I'm just going to mark my leather, and there's the second bit of it goes in just here. And I want to make sure that I've got it deep enough and that I can still extract the knife. So I'll mark it here as well. So that's where I think it's going. Can I still extract my knife easily and get it in easily? Yeah, I think that's all right. It's always a little bit of test and feel. I can possibly open it up as well. I can just about peep in there and see that looks quite reasonable. And what I'm most importantly wanting is a sufficient margin for stitching down this line. So quite happy with that. There's enough space. You need 8mm or so to allow for your stitching. So what I'll do now is I'll glue this welt into position. So I'm going to put glue on both sides. I think I'll just give this smooth surface a little bit of a rough as well. And that will help the glue hold a little bit better. So I'm going to be using standard leather glue, so it's a little bit like the PVA wood glue. So glue on both sides and I will clamp it. Oops. There we are. Right, so that's being positioned on my marked line. All this waste here will get trimmed off in a minute, but I want it there just so I can make sure I got my positioning right. And it's the same idea as before actually. It's use the little clips with a little bit of protection. So I've got my welt gluing in, got lots of clips to try and hold it in position. I think I'll put another one in just there. But yeah, so that's hopefully, there we are, will be gluing up nicely. I'll let that dry properly, and then what I'll be doing, I'll trim off this excess and I'll pop a sander down it just to get it all levelled up, and then I'll be ready for some sewing. Yep, that's fine. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to trim off my welt, and then I will soon be ready for some stitching. So I'm just going to level this off a bit. There we are. I've just been cleaning up this edge a bit, and I'm now going to put a groove down for the stitching. So I'm using a little grooving tool here, and the idea is to sort of recess the stitching. So that's my grooving tool, and it has a little cutter on the end here, and what it does, it takes a little channel out in the leather, and like that I can get the stitches below the surface of the leather, and that way they're protected from abrasion, and hope that my holes match up. It's always a bit of a test. Well, I'm just going along drilling some holes with my Dremel, so this will be for sewing. I marked the gap between the holes using this little stitch marking tool. So it's a little coggy wheel, which as you rub it up and down the leather, you get little pin mark impressions. So that's how I've done the spacing, and now, as I say, I'm just drilling them out. So I'm just using a standard Dremel. It's quite useful for leathercraft, for doing odd little jobs. I also use it sometimes for cutting off saddler's rivets if I need to, if something's gone wrong, or for whatever reason you want to remove a saddler's rivet. So it's quite useful using the cutting discs for that. You can get these little tiny drills. It's a little bit like going to the dentist. You hear this whining noise. Not certain what I think about that, but still, I'll carry on doing my drilling. With the holes drilled, I now just need to sew this up. So I'm going to be using some Ritzer 25 tiger thread, and I find this very good for general sewing. It's a nice braided polyester thread. It's nice and flat, and normally I would reckon on taking 4 times the sort of length of stitching. So I'd just say, because I'm doing traditional saddle stitch, so I'd say, right, 4 times the length of the stitching, that should be enough. But of course, what you've got to bear in mind with this, it's jolly thick. It's getting on for a centimetre thick. So I'm going to need a fair bit more than 4 times. And it's a bit of a sort of guesstimate, to be honest, because it's not like I do many of these. So I'm going to take it up, I think almost double actually, because of that thickness. So I'm going to do 8 times, which is a bit excessive. We'll see how it goes. And threading up my needles, I just do the usual. I've done this in other films where I flatten the thread against the side of the needle, put it through, and then so the needle doesn't fall off the thread, I just stab the thread like that. These are saddler's needles, so they're quite blunt. Pull it over, and that's locked the needle on. So I'm going to do that on each end of the thread. I feel now I've got far too long a bit of thread, but we'll see. Same idea, pop it through, stab it on, and I'm ready for sewing. So, going to do the traditional saddle stitch using 2 needles. Always find with this, and I know I've mentioned this in other films, if you're consistent in the way you go in each time, always go in from the same side first, you'll get a nice result. Usually I would pop this in a saddler's clam, but obviously it's a bit rounded and a bit of an awkward shape, so it's easier actually just to hold it while I stitch. And I've got my nice holes all done, so that's straightforward. The stitching is obviously going below the surface, so it won't get abraded in use. Or if I store this with other tools, then the thread won't get knocked by whatever else I might have, like axes or hammers or whatever with me at the time. Don't think this knife would be street legal in the UK nowadays. It is odd because I look at this and think, well, I used to go around as a kid with a knife like this. You certainly couldn't do that now. Probably couldn't walk down my local high street and get very far without being stopped, I'm sure. And I'm sure if I took it into London, I'd have the armed police on me. Anyway, I will keep on going down here. You'll get the idea. It's quite attractive, getting a little bit of colour contrast there. Hopefully you can see the stitching. So it's nicely sunk down in its channel. Chosen the red because it sort of matches the red on the knife, not entirely, but it's a reasonable sort of bit of contrast. It looks quite nice. So I'll carry on going down here. I did far too much of the tiger thread, but never mind. Come to the end, so I'm just going to trim these off. So I'm just leaving a little bit of excess, probably about 1/8 of an inch, 3mm roughly, and I'm just going to burn the ends to a blob. Ideally with this, if you can sort of heat them, then they sort of melt backwards and form a nice globule, rather than actually have them catch fire. Because then you can push them in, and they keep a lot of the thread colour there as well. Just smudge them in. Hopefully that will keep in position. There we are. Right. So this just helps to make sure the stitches are nicely pushed down into their groove. I'm just doing a little bit of like tidying up now. So one of the products I quite like is called Tokonole, Tokonole. Probably have to buy it from Japan or somewhere, China, Japan. But where it's useful is where you've got the inside of your leather surface. If you rub this on, it actually makes it nice and smooth. It gives it like a coating. I mean, people use this for edge finishing, but it's actually very useful where you want to try and make some leather look a bit shinier and give it some body on the reverse side. It sort of helps it to blend in quite well. And that sort of blends that in quite nicely. I mean, you can, it's leather finishing, you can.
I can't find the song in Crowd Nicely in your music library.
Alexa, quiet. You may have
Jeff Bezos.
Stop. Alexa, stop. Sorry about that interruption. One of the things I have is one of these voice things you talk to for playing music and what have you. And I find them very good in a workshop. When you're working with your hands and you want to have some music or hear the news or whatever, to have one of these Alexas, Google Home Hubby type things is jolly useful. So, but I normally, if I'm filming, I turn it off. And I was having a little break. I was having a bit of the Who with Quadrophenia. There we are. Okay, so giving that a nice little final. I've sealed this edge already, actually, with a bit of my sealant. So that's going to keep it waterproof. And I think I'm pretty well there with this. Nice bit of luster. So there you have it. I better take the price label off this knife. It seems to have remarkably have stayed on there. Should give the knife a bit of a further clean up and a sharpen. But there's the sheath, all completed. And I've got my nice big thick welt in so the stitching doesn't get cut. And the knife, as I wanted it, goes right down in the sheath, but giving me enough space to get my fingers in to pull it out. There you have it, one finished knife sheath. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching that one, and see you in the next film. Thanks very much for your watching. Bye bye then.